Welcome. My name is Father Joseph Gill, priest of the Diocese of Bridgeport, and it's a great joy that you've joined us on Catholic Truth. So today's talk is going to be about spiritual warfare. Now you might say, are you going to talk about possession? No, I'm not going to talk about possession. Yes, possession is real. I've helped with an exorcism, so I can tell you it is absolutely real. But Satan is not that interested in possessing people. He's much more interested in tempting people. Because first of all, temptation is the spiritual warfare that all of us experience on a daily basis. And if we fall into sin, then we're kind of already on Satan's side. So we have to realize that we live in a world at war. In fact, St. Maximilian Kolbe said that the battleground between God and Satan is the human soul. The battleground between God and Satan is the human soul. We have to realize the spiritual battle is not out there as much as it is in here. You may have heard this story. It's kind of a famous story about two Native Americans, an old warrior and a young brave, sitting around a campfire having a conversation. And the old warrior is telling the young brave that within every human heart, there are two wolves, a good wolf and a bad wolf. And the two are constantly fighting to see who's going to have dominion. And the young brave says, well, who wins the battle? And the old warrior says, the one that you feed, the one that you feed. I think this is the good news, is that the spiritual battle between God and Satan, we get to decide who wins. Right now, at this very moment, God is doing everything in his power to save our souls. Right now, at this very moment, Satan is doing everything in his power to get you to lose your soul. The choice is up to you as to who you're going to allow win your soul for eternity, whether it's going to be God, who wants it desperately, so desperately he's willing to die for it, or Satan, who also wants it desperately, and he wants your eternal misery. So let's take a look at the three sources of temptation that we face on a daily basis, and the three ways in which our church gives us to overcome. So the first source of temptation is the devil. Now, when I say the devil, I don't necessarily mean worshiping Satan, as if you're a Satanist. There are certainly many ways in which we can get involved in the occult, such as tarot cards, Ouija boards, going to mediums or psychics. These sorts of things, although they look harmless on the outside, they're really consulting the evil one. Because there's really only two beings that know the future. There's God and there's Satan. Now, strictly speaking, Satan doesn't have an absolute knowledge of the future, but he's a very good guesser, and so he can certainly reveal certain things about us and about our habits, about how things are going to be in the future. So if we're not asking God, then who are we asking? If we're going to a medium or a psychic, if we're seeking some sort of spiritualism, then what are we doing? We're seeking out Satan. So we have to avoid that as well. But probably the main way in which Satan is the source of temptation is that Satan's main sin is pride. Think about it. Do you know how Satan originally kind of became Satan? According to Catholic theology, he was once an angel called Lucifer. Lucifer means the light bearer, the one who carries the light. And he was one of the most glorious of the angels, one of the most beautiful archangels. But he became so puffed up with pride that he said to God, non serviam, which means I will not serve. According to tradition, God showed all of the angels the plan of salvation, of how God was going to take on flesh as a human being and die on a cross for our salvation. And Lucifer thought this was so outrageous that God was going to become a human. Angels are so much higher than human beings on the scale of being. And so for an angel to worship a God who takes on flesh would be unthinkable. It's like us bowing down to an ant or a worm. And so Lucifer said, I will never worship a God who humbles himself so much. And so out of the pride of Lucifer, he rebelled against God, and he got cast out of heaven and into the pits of hell. So when we are tempted to pride, that's a temptation from the evil one, from the devil. So when we say the devil is the first source of temptation, what we mean is that pride really is the root of all other sins. And pride manifests itself in a lot of different ways. One of the biggest ways pride manifests itself is thinking to ourselves, I got this. I don't need God. I can do this whole life thing on my own. All I need is my hard work. All I need is my money. All I need is my science. All I need is just myself. I'm an individual. I'm strong. I don't need God. Ultimately, that is the temptation of pride, of saying, I don't need God at all in my life. So if that is the source of temptation, pride, what's the antidote? Humility, and humility is expressed in our relationship with God through prayer. Because prayer says, God, I need you desperately. God, I can do nothing without you. That's something that we have to keep in mind. When we don't pray, we're saying, I don't need you, God. You know, a lot of times I'll ask teens, do you pray every day? No, maybe once a week, twice a week, maybe every other day. If you don't pray every day, do you really live like you believe that God is necessary in your life? I mean, think about it. If I asked you, do you eat every day? No, not really. No, just maybe once a week. Wait, isn't food necessary for your physical survival? Yeah, of course. Isn't prayer necessary for your spiritual survival? Absolutely. So we have to have that kind of seriousness about having a relationship with the Lord Jesus through prayer. So the first source of temptation then is the devil. The second source of temptation is the world. Now, the world is not necessarily bad in and of itself. And when I say the world, I mean things like riches, things like fame and popularity. These are the things of the world. And they're not bad in and of themselves, but when we put them above God, when we make them the goal of our life, that's when it becomes bad news. One of my favorite saints is a saint you've probably never heard of. Her name is Saint Hyacintha Mariscotti. She sounds like a great Italian dessert, Hyacintha Mariscotti. But she's a woman who lived for the first part of her life all for the things of this world. When she was a teenager, she lived in the 1500s in Italy, and she thought the entire world revolved around the parties that she would attend, around the makeup and the boys, and just everything that's made life so rich for her. She was very wealthy. She would go to all these parties, flirt with all the guys, spend hours on her fine clothes, her fine hair. And she had this one guy in particular that she really had the hots for. She said, that's the guy. That's the guy that I want to marry. And this particular guy started to show some interest in her. He would come over to her family's house on Sundays for Sunday dinner and take long walks with the family. She thought, this is great. This young man is going to propose to me. She had all her hopes set on that one thing. So finally one day, the young man comes over, and Hyacintha thinks, this is the day. This is the day he's going to propose. And so the young man goes into the other room with her parents. She's like, oh, this is it. This is it. And the young man and her parents come out, and the parents say, we have great news for you all. This young man wants to marry your younger sister. No! Her entire life was over. She felt so crushed. She felt like there was no point of her existence anymore. So she said, I might as well become a nun. She said, I'm never going to get married to anyone else. I'm just going to go join the convent. And so she did. And she carried her worldly ways with her into the convent. Back in those days, nuns had to make their own habits. The habit is the garment that nuns wear. And she made hers out of the finest silk that was very comfortable, very smooth, very expensive. While the other nuns would be fasting, she actually had her friends bring her some food that she kept in a drawer in her room, so she wouldn't have to fast. She'd go back to her room and snack throughout the day. While the rest of the sisters were doing penance and were praying in the chapel, she would sneak off the convent grounds and go and join her old friends. Now you might be thinking to yourself, how in the world did this woman become a saint who's so steeped in the things of this world? As it turned out, she ended up getting very sick, to the point that everyone thought she might die. And so they called in a priest to give her the last sacraments. And when the priest walked into the room and saw her silk habit and saw the drawer full of food that she would snack on, the priest was horrified. And the priest said, how in the world can you do this? I thought you were supposed to be a nun. If you don't change your ways, you're going to be condemned to hell for all eternity. Well, Hyacintha kind of woke up, and she said to herself, oh my goodness, You're right, I'd been living my life totally for the things of this world and not for the things of God. She ended up recovering from that illness, and she changed her ways completely. She gave away her silken habit and instead made one out of rough cloth. Instead of all the food which she gave to the poor, she started practicing very rigorous fasting. And she gave her time up to prayer, and she broke off all of those friendships that she would have that would lead her away from God. And now she's a great saint because she said, the world, as good as it may be, is nothing compared to God who offers himself to me. So if we find that the world, riches, the power, the popularity, if that's going to be our source of temptation, what's the antidote to that? The antidote is almsgiving. Almsgiving simply means giving to the poor. It's a way of living life very simply and saying, everything I own doesn't really belong to me. I have to be a steward of it for God. And so we give generously to the poor so that we can grow in that detachment from worldly goods. Okay, so we talked about the devil. We talked about the world. The third and final source of temptation is the flesh. Now again, the body is not bad. But when bodily pleasures become more important than spiritual goods, that becomes problematic. And a lot of saints struggled with that. They struggled with their flesh. St. Augustine, for example, one time prayed, he said, Lord, give me chastity, but not yet. He was still so addicted to lust and to the physical pleasures of this world. I think all of us find that to sometimes be a struggle, right? We go to an all-you-can-eat buffet and we know, okay, I'll take 3 helpings, but then we take 6. We say to ourselves, you know what? I'm going to remain pure until marriage. But then all of a sudden we find ourselves clicking in the wrong websites and looking at pornography and some of the evil things online. Again, it's not that the body's desires are bad. We should want to eat. We should want sexual pleasure in the right way in which God intended it. So if we find that our flesh is weak, if this is the source of temptation, what's the way to overcome that? The way is fasting. Fasting means giving up some sort of bodily pleasure in order for spiritual good, to grow in self-control. So for example, if I give up a chocolate bar, it becomes easier to give up perhaps a word of gossip. If I'm able to refrain from sleeping in past the time that my alarm goes off, then it becomes easier to refrain from other sins that are going to take equally as much self-control. So these are the 3 sources of temptation: the world, the flesh, and the devil. But thankfully, our church gives us 3 ways to overcome those things. If the flesh is our temptation, we turn to fasting. If the things of this world, the material goods, is our temptation, we turn to almsgiving. If we find that pride is what puffs us up and takes us away from God and makes us reliant on ourselves, then we pray. And we recognize in our prayer that God alone is God and that we are simply his humble servants, his sons and daughters. But if these are the 3 temptations, how do they get into us? Because it seems like they're still out there. The world is out there. The devil is out there. There's 3 what we call gates where temptations come into us. And we've got to guard these gates very clearly so that we stay on the right path. The first gate is the gate of our senses. You may remember an old commercial. I think it was for an insurance company or something. But there was a guy who was sitting at a table in a coffee shop, and he was typing on his laptop computer. He's typing away, and all of a sudden he looks up, and he sees a couple across the restaurant, and this couple is making out, like big time. They're sucking each other's face off. And the tagline on this commercial, he got this look on his face like, and he just looked back down to his computer and kept typing. And the tagline was, you can't unsee things. What a great statement. You can't unsee things. You can't unhear things. The first line of defense is our 5 senses. Because what we see, what we hear, what we listen to becomes our thoughts. And our thoughts become our words. And our words become our actions. And our actions become our habits. And our habits become our character. And our character becomes our destiny. So if we want to have a good destiny, if we want to someday look upon the face of God, we have to make sure that what we look upon here on earth is good, holy, and pure. as St. Paul tells us to do. I was a chaplain at a Catholic high school for 3 years, and all the time the kids would be sitting in my office and they'd be jamming to something on their ear pods and just kind of listening. And I'd say, "Hey, Johnny, what are you listening to?" And they'd kind of be like, kind of take them out, and I say, like, "Johnny, like, come on, let me have a listen." Like, "No, you wouldn't like that." I said, "Well, try me.